about SID, which is a wonderful organization. SID consists of many people, many institutions from a wide, can you hear me? Okay. From a wide, there we are, great. From a wide variety of people involved in the development community. SID speaks of itself as being the global town hall for ideas. Really focuses on informing more than advocacy. There are a few important events coming up in the next few months that I want to just refer you to. One is the annual conference on June 5 here in Washington. A number of very distinguished people from around the world will be there speaking in that one-day, all-day conference. Obviously, it will focus on what's going on in Washington and what's going on in foreign assistance, but we're also hoping to get some points of view from other developers, development leaders from around the world. Next month, the chapter event will focus on International Women's Day in March. Sally, I don't know the exact date. It's the third week in March at some point, I'm told, so look forward to that. And of course, SID has a number of working groups that work through the year, and they can be found on the SID website. It's a membership organization for individuals as well as institutions, as I mentioned. So for any of you who are interested in participating individually or with your institution, not only is it a nice place to have good conversations, but you get to do that with your friends. So with that, I'll turn the floor over to Barry, and she will introduce the panel. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Mary Freeman. I'm the Director for North Africa Programs at the National Democratic Institute, and it's really a pleasure to be here today. I will start by introducing the panelists. Ambassador Pearson, who just spoke, has had a long and distinguished career in the Foreign Service, and now he's president of IREX in that position since November of 2008. He was Director General of the Foreign Service and has also served as ambassador to Turkey and was posted in Paris, Brussels, Beijing, Taipei, Auckland, and in addition to serving in a variety of senior positions at the State Department in Washington, here in Washington. Tom Vida, over at the other end, is also a member of the Foreign Service, and he's currently the director of the Middle East Partnership Initiative. Prior to that assignment, he was the deputy chief of mission in Rangoon in Burma, which is kind of an interesting, given their transition that they just launched, is kind of an interesting juxtaposition. He has also served overseas in the Balkans and in South Korea and Germany. Scott Mastick is the director for IRI's the International Republican Institute's Middle East and North Africa region. It's IRI's largest region with programs in 10 countries. He oversees programs in Afghanistan, Egypt, Jordan, Morocco, Oman, Pakistan, Syria, Tunisia, United Arab Emirates, and West Bank, Gaza. He has served on a variety of international election missions and other political assessment missions around the world. Before joining IRI, he had a career in politics, working in the Ohio legislature, and also as the chairman of the Ohio Senate Finance and Economic Development Committee. Served
as a staff. Yeah.
Sorry. Anyway, when I was first asked to help moderate this panel, when I saw the title, I saw Arab Winter, I just thought, just about the danger of labels. I think Arab Spring certainly sounded good. I think it still sounds good. I think spring is kind of an eternal season, and I wouldn't say that we're seeing a winter in the Arab world right now. I think, but when the Arab Spring started, it kind of, we were all, I think, all over the world, people were swept up in what seemed to be this wave of citizens across the region standing up for more accountable and effective governance, standing up for dignity, for their rights, and they all seem to look very much the same. But in the years since, the countries have gone down very different paths. And these paths reflect their different histories, cultures, and political dynamics. In countries like Tunisia and Libya, dictators were ousted, and new players are in this opening political space. In a lot of other countries in the region, you've got existing governments or remnants of those governments that are trying, some more successfully than others, just to adapt to new realities. But I think what we all know is that transitions are very hard, they're not linear, and they take years, if not decades, to complete if they're ever really completed. But we're here to talk today about what that means for international development, especially for development supported by the United States. Scott and I and our organizations are spending a lot of time these days on Egypt, where DG, Democracy and Governance Aid, is kind of very much in the sights. And I think it could very, very well have a broader impact in the region and beyond on just how the United States supports democratic transitions around the world, particularly democratic transitions that are launched by people, by citizens themselves. So with that, I will turn it over to Ambassador Pearson.
In any case, I think awakening is a much better description of lots of things here rather than seasonal approaches. I think the most important thing about this region, the most important thing about this revolution, is that it is completely unpredictable. No one imagined that Mohamed Bouazizi would have immolated himself in Tunisia in December of 2010. And no one would have imagined the flow of events that followed. So I think that to relieve yourselves of the burden of trying to anticipate what's going to happen next, it's good just to step back and say that it's going to be quite unpredictable. The other thing is, it's going to be very long term. You know that the last French emperor left the throne in 1871 after a French Revolution in 1789. You could argue that the Russian Revolution is still going on. You could argue that the Chinese Revolution is still going on. These things take, as Barry said, a long, long time. So I think it would be helpful not to anticipate that democracy is going to suddenly emerge in a year, 2 years, 5 years, or 10 years in a region that is nevertheless moving in a direction that it's never been done before. Thirdly, it's their revolution. All of the motive power, all of the real intellect, all of the energy, most of the risk is going to come from the people involved. And I think that gives us a chance in the development community to think of them more and more as leading partners, us as catalysts and assistants in the process. Because of the news cycle we all suffer from, you have people think of the Middle East as the stock market. When it's going up, you straight line it, things are looking great. It's going down, suddenly the bottom's going to fall out, chaos is going to appear. It's not the stock market. If there is a stock market analogy, it is that over decades of time, the stock market tends to go up, which is a nice optimistic point of view. But don't think of every day's events, and don't get caught up in the latest pundits' attempt to capture the essence of what's going on in the region. It just isn't possible. It's good for entertainment, it may be good for analysis in a year or so, but it is not actually a prediction. We all have said that, of course, every country is different. Let's skip over that point to make another one, which it's currently popular to think of the lessons learned from Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union for the Middle East. And I would just be, from my own perspective, just a little bit cautious there. And I'll explain why. When the Cold War ended, the Berlin Wall fell, there was already a pre-existing cultural space that was defined as Europe that 1945 artificially divided in two. It began to put itself back together again. There was also a tendency for, I remember myself, major American law firms heading off to Moscow with grand plans and healthy invoices to aid the Russians in their work. And I think that it would be a little inaccurate to think that there is an American solution for the issues that our colleagues in the Middle East are going to face. So be a little bit careful about drawing too many lessons from Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union for use in the Middle East. The next point I want to make, I think, is even to myself a bit controversial, so I don't mind if you differ with it either. But just imagine that in the region your perspective was that we have no enemies. We have no enemies. That everything that's going on there lies along some part of a spectrum. In some places it's going better, it's more open, and so on. But even in the worst places, I can tell you that people are having those conversations. I was in the region about 4 months before the Arab awakening began, and I was astonished at the number of people, let's say 35 and under, all over the region, from Iraq all the way out to Tunisia, who were talking the same language, sharing the same ideas, had the same ambitions about the growth of their societies. They just weren't in a position or weren't willing at that point to challenge the political or the religious strictures under which they were living. But those conversations are still going on. So one image you might hold in the back of your mind is that even the bad guys are just potentially in need of transformation, if we put it that way. And not to organize our thoughts and our activities as if there are enemies and good guys around the region. When you stop back and think about it, what really is going to matter is what happens after victory. People always tend to have an illusion that up until the moment that the regime under question has fallen is the critical point. It is critical. What really builds a society is what happens after that point. And that's very important. A couple of evaluations. First, it is a watershed event. It is on the order of the fall of the Soviet Union. It is on the order of 1848. It is on the order of a seismic shift in the world of politics, the Chinese Revolution. So it is a magnificent event that's going to play out for a long time. 4 down, how many to go? We don't know. But it's clear that the Syrian regime is under increasing pressure. The UNGA vote yesterday or today underlined that. It's clear what the momentum in the region is. And so I don't think we've seen the end of regime change in the region. And I'm sure that's one of the main reasons why the Russians and the Chinese vetoed the UN Security Council resolution on Syria. It shows that Israel is not the only country in the region that can become a democracy. I think that's vitally important for the future of the region and, of course, for us. 2 big losers. First big loser is Iran. Turkey is much more often seen as a potential model for development in the region than Iran is. The Iranians lost their audience. The second big loser, of course, is terrorism. Nobody not only has picked up the Al-Qaeda cudgel, everyone in the young, and at least in the young generation, has turned against it. I think those are things that go a little bit unspoken sometimes, but I think it ought to give us all a sense of optimism about where the energy of the region is going. What can we do? Professional to professional relationships being strengthened as a catalyst in the region. I've already mentioned that. Another point I've alluded to, think less of obstacles, think more of opportunities. There's something we can do almost anywhere. Lessons learned. I've talked about Eastern Europe, and at least my perspective. Recasting the talent. Remember that once the revolution is over, once the good guys have won, then you want the entire society to play a role in rebuilding. You don't want to transmit your enemies and friends scenario from pre-victory to the post-victory environment. We want to be able to embrace people who were sitting on the sidelines or might even have opposed the revolution in what has to happen in the coming development of the country. Just to close really quickly, I'll talk about points of reference. I gave some brief evaluations. I talked about some approaches that I think would be very useful for us to think about. And I'll end with my central point, which is it's their revolution. We are there to assist them, to aid them, to be catalysts, to provide talent where they need, but it's their values, their culture, their choices, which will make a lasting result. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This doesn't work very well. Sorry. Can you hear me? There we go. All right, I'm going to turn it now to Scott, who can talk a little bit about support in the democracy and governance field, just as a real practitioner on the ground, or as Senator McCain referred to us a couple of weeks ago, the mechanics of democracy building.
Thanks, Mary. Well, Barry and I, of course, are
Thank you.
Is that on? Barry and I, of course, are in the optimism business, so I'm going to try to lend a little bit of optimism to today. It's not just because I'm representing IRI, though. It's because I believe we really have started a process of historic change in the region and change in historic proportions that's not going to be reversed. And I guess what I would just say at the outset is sort of the notion that where we're starting from is 5 decades of undemocratic rule, where autocrats stayed in power, and we can't expect in one whirlwind year of change for the issues of governance and participation in societies to be sorted out. We should expect what we're seeing in terms of the degree of upheaval we're seeing in different countries, all of which are taking on a very localized context. I share the ambassador's hesitancy, I guess, of making too many parallels between what we saw in the former Soviet republics of Eastern Europe and the Middle East. But to underscore that point, I would say that we keep in mind that places like Romania and Bulgaria, democratic transitions took 7 years to achieve, and in Serbia, 10 years on, there was autocrats in power. So in the Middle East, where there's not experience with democratic participation in governance, I think we should expect that sorting through the issues of accountability and who gets a say in decision-making are going to take some time. I want to start with Tunisia, because I think Tunisia is where it started. I think in Tunisia we see some encouraging signs about how far the country has come. Tunisia's held a first successful election. They welcomed international observers. Incidentally, our organization and NDI, I think, are both registered in Tunisia by the Tunisian government. They elected the National Constituent Assembly in October last year. The Islamist Ennahda Party was the winner of that election. What's transpired since is that they built a coalition of both secular and Islamist thought. The Speaker of the Assembly is a long-standing and well-known secular opposition activist. They've started the task of writing a constitution, and it's slow going, but it's interesting that the country hasn't lurched toward this ideological battle that many people, I think, fear. They haven't lurched toward this ideological battle that I think many people fear would have happened between Islamists and secular forces. To the contrary, the government that they've appointed is very much focused on turning the country around economically and getting it back on track. Our staff has just visited Libya, and NDI has active programming going on there, and I think both organizations in the Libyan context are very much welcome in the experience we've had interacting with people thus far. Libya is on a track to hold elections in 8 months' time. That might be optimistic, given that they've never held a democratic election before. At least in Tunisia, there used to be sham elections. In Libya, there were no elections. And no one's really had any sort of experience participating in that kind of exercise, either as voters or candidates or organizing an election. Even so, I think it's safe to say the Libyan Transitional Council has done better than a lot of people expected in putting the country on a course toward change. And it may be optimistic to hold an election on the time frame they're talking about, but there's not really debate right now, and I don't expect to see it, about whether they should hold elections as the mechanism to move the country forward. And so that too, I think, is an encouraging sign. Egypt and Syria are obviously in a different place right now and are troubling, but those are big countries with complicated challenges. And so I don't want to discount the importance of what we're seeing in places like Tunisia and Libya, because there is positive progress in those places. And I think a key question that is before the region and all of us as development people is simply, what are the lessons that are being learned from the Tunisian and Libyan context that may be relevant, can be applied in those tough places? There's been a lot of talk in Washington, I know, and a lot of interest in the result of elections that we're seeing across the region, essentially bringing Islamists to power. One thing I think is important to keep in mind with respect to those elections is simply that in the past, there wasn't real choices in elections. And in fact, the presence of autocrats and one-party systems that railroaded electoral exercises previously saw institutions of states slowly erode and to become instruments of the status quo and those power holders. In the process, other voices, and specifically those that I would characterize as moderate secular voices, were routinely silenced. And they were silenced primarily because the regimes saw those voices as a threat to their own position of power. And they, at the same time, actively cultivated this culture where the choice was between dictators or unknown Islams. That went on for a long time, and in the course of those decades, Islamists were able to capture this mantle of opposition in countries, build grassroots networks, build extensive charity and patronage networks, and they find themselves today in a much better position to experience electoral success in early elections. What I would say, though, is what we know from other democratic transitions around the world is that one election is not a democracy making, right? And typically, groups that experience success in initial elections are not always the groups that have staying power within the hall. Now, I think that we're going to need to see a lot of elections in the Middle East for a new political culture to develop. Some of that may be driven by more secular elements, some by Islamist groups that incidentally are not a monolithic part of the political spectrum. In a lot of countries, you see the second or third election being more important than those first transitional elections. In the Middle East, it may take 5, 6, or 7 elections to get to that part. The important part, and I think what we all need to be cognizant of and focus on, is trying to make sure that those subsequent elections occur and occur in a democratic fashion and continue to occur on transition schedules that are set forth by the decision makers that the elections before them put into power. Last thing I would just want to add is a lot has been made about the economic underpinnings of what we're seeing in the Arab awakening as being the primary driver behind citizen demands. That's definitely true. I think there's not debate about that, but
What I would add to it is simply those demands very quickly metastasize into questions about legitimacy and credibility of governments and rulers. There's a reason that people in Tahrir Square held signs that said, we want to sack the regime and not, we want more jobs and economic growth. And that's because there was a crisis of confidence in governance. People ultimately protested because there wasn't a belief that the institutions of government or the processes by which governments should be held accountable were legitimate. And so as we move forward working with people of the Arab world in the changes we see and the changes that continue, process I think is very important with respect to ultimately delivering the delivery needs and the economic demands that people have. And that ultimately, from my read, means a desire to have more democratic participation, more democratic processes, more of a say in what's going on. I see that at the core of this dignity question. Lastly, I would add, the absence of a focus on democratic process in the past, regrettably, has caused a lot of the assistance that we have given to be seen as having further entrenched under democratic regimes and practices, as opposed to being enabling in the sense of helping people achieve more accountability and changes that they demand. And so, again, I would underscore the importance of changing that dynamic, both through ensuring development is seen as directly impacting and delivered to people in the region, and from a mechanical standpoint, from a process level, ensuring that there's accountability and a say that people have and how the bilateral relationships are worked out, and direct government interactions and exchanges. So I would leave it there.
Thanks. Good afternoon, everybody. I'd like to first thank SID for inviting me to participate in this panel and for organizing this discussion. I think obviously it's very timely. And it's a pleasure for me to be on this panel with representatives of three organizations that the Middle East Partnership Initiative, MEPI, has proudly funded in the past and in the present. Just by way of introduction, my name is Tom Biden. As indicated, I'm a career foreign service officer serving as the director of MEPI for the last 6 months. I want to talk a little bit today about MEPI's response to events in the region over the past year. Try to put that first in some policy context and give you my own thoughts and reflections on the subject matter and the title of this discussion today, at least from the perspective and the experiences of the MEPI program. And I'd be happy, obviously, to take questions. I think anybody who's in this room, I think, would readily admit that they could not have foreseen 12, 14 months ago the changes that have come in this region. They've been very dramatic and inspired many people. U.S. policy, I think, has changed to reflect these new circumstances. I would say that U.S. core interests remain the same. They include the free flow of commerce, freedom of navigation, energy security, Arab-Israeli peace, and issues of the like. But the way in which we are trying to achieve those objectives have changed. And I think the most significant revision in our approach is the elevation of support for political reform and democratic transition throughout the region. I think there used to be an assumption prior to the Arab Spring that reform and progress and stability were mutually exclusive, that reform would invite instability. And I think that events of the last year have really turned that assumption on its head. As the Secretary and the President have made clear, our perspective is that, in fact, it's the absence of reform which today is the greatest challenge to stability. It's impossible to go back to the status quo ante. The people of the region have demonstrated that they're demanding different forms of governance and a greater voice in their own affairs. And I think perhaps Syria best illustrates that great instability And difficulty arises when governments refuse to acknowledge and respond to those aspirations. And I think it's, again, the Assad regime's outrageous and lawless assault on its own people, who I think have shown remarkable courage and resiliency over the last few months in trying to demand change in the way they're governed, illustrates that, I think, that new paradigm. And I think MEPI has tried to play a role in, I think, facilitating this new approach. And our perspective has always been, and continues to be, and I think is more important than ever, that our role is really to identify and support those individuals and groups in the region who are themselves striving for change. And again, I think this contradicts the notion that somehow the United States has an agenda or is seeking to influence events. At least certainly in the case of MEPI and for the U.S. government program, it's exactly the opposite. Our approach really is bottom-up and demand-driven. So we work through local grants, we work through Washington grants, but the key element is that we are responding to local needs, and those are different across the region because we operate all across North Africa, the Levant, and the Gulf as well, all countries in which the United States has diplomatic presence, and also in the West Bank and Gaza. I think that one of our programs that illustrates this best is what I refer to as our local grants program. About half our active projects, which number about 200 right now, are done on a local level, which means they're implemented by embassies, and they work directly with nascent civil society groups and private sector organizations, academic institutions that are themselves working on issues of importance to them. So there's really no clear mandate or requirement. We respond to the interests of the population of those countries. So in Tunisia, where there's quite a bit of space for political activity, a lot of that work surrounded the elections, voter education, domestic observation. In the Gulf, which is a somewhat more restrictive environment, there's still opportunities to work with women who want to gain leadership skills so they can play a greater role in their societies, companies that want to create corporate social responsibility programs, the West Bank and Gaza, we work with student groups, for example, who want more say in their educational programs and such. So the type of programs we support are really quite varied. And I want to get back to that a little bit later in terms of what it means in terms of events in the region. But I also want to say that we do work, as I noted, with established international NGOs like the ones represented here on this table. And in those cases, again, we're trying to facilitate training, assistance, know-how for organizations, and again, encourage these international institutions to partner with local organizations to support specific needs and aspirations that they have. And I'll just give you an example of some of the ones that we're pursuing in the near term. Again, they represent this bottom-up approach. There are a couple focused on civil society. One is to provide support to these really nascent civil society groups throughout the region. I mean, there's been a proliferation of these organizations and groups. I think they reflect the interest and the passions of these populations to get involved, to move beyond their atomized societies, and whether it's to provide service to their communities or to somehow shape the political discourse. We want to make sure that we take advantage of this window of opportunity and help these organizations grow and develop. We're also working with more developed civil society organizations who want to get more involved in advocacy, which we think is very important, whether it's around constitutional reform, the rights of women, new legislation, electoral issues. Again, our perspective is that civil society should have an important role in shaping the outcome of these developments. And I think that reflects our own perspective that countries with vibrant civil societies are generally more prosperous and more stable and have governments that represent the interests of their populations. If you think about the U.S. experience, a lot of the important social changes that have occurred in our country, whether it's the civil rights movement or women's right to vote, or ending child labor, all these issues really began with grassroots movement that ultimately informed and influenced government decisions. So I think it's an important model for us to follow. We also continue to do work in political processes areas. There are going to be a number of elections that continue to take place throughout the region. There's a real hunger for understanding about what that means and how individuals and groups can become involved, how political parties can organize and campaign. Whenever we support those kinds of programs, and this is, I know, fundamental to IRI and NDI, it's an open-door policy. So we're not picking and choosing the programs we're open to. Whichever individuals or parties want to participate, there's self-selection. So long as they espouse and are committed to democratic values, we're happy to work with them. Rule of law is a critical issue, we think, and so we're working in areas like constitutional reform, in freedom of association, freedom of expression, whether it's media laws or NGO laws. Again, these are areas that we think are important, that represent important U.S. values, but more importantly, are issues that are important to the people in the region as they seek to institutionalize some of the changes that have taken place thus far. And also, I want to get to this notion about this Arab winter and speak to it really just from the particular perspective and experience of MEPI. So as noted, we do a lot of work directly at the grassroots, and in many cases it's U.S. embassy officials who are interacting with these civil society organizations and members. And despite the headlines, the understandable focus on events in Egypt as they relate to NGOs in Syria. By and large, we have seen a remarkable increase in demand and interest in working with MEPI and the United States government. And that's particularly true in some of our exchange programs where applications are in many cases up twofold. It's certainly true in the case of these local small grants programs where in many cases demand for these activities have tripled. And in fact, the two places where demand for these MEPI grants are greatest are Egypt and the West Bank, places where there certainly is some degree of anti-American attitude and even some suspicion about our intentions. But by and large, there are large cohorts in these countries who even now, even in Egypt, continue to knock on the door of U.S. embassies and look to partner with us. And I think that's really an important bellwether because when individuals attend, say, an NDI or an IRI training program or an IRX program, there's a bit of distance between them and the U.S. government. But when they're doing some of these local grants, they really are working with us directly. So to the questions to really the future of the region, I must admit I myself am optimistic because when I travel through the region and continue to meet with often young people, they're engaged, they're active, they're happy to work with us, they acknowledge that they lack capacity and training and in some cases funding, and they desperately are hungry for those tools so they can continue to make a difference in their lives. And I think that aspiration really will be fundamental to the prospect of positive change over time. And another personal reflection, I think it's absolutely true what some of the panelists have said, that there are great differences between the events in the Middle East and North Africa and those in Eastern Europe. But my father participated in the Hungarian Revolution in 1956, so obviously the events of 1980 are quite important for my family. Served in the Balkans during periods of transition. I just came from Burma, as I noted, which is obviously a country that's long been seeking, or at least that has a population long seeking democratic change. But I think there is something, though, that's universal about all these different experiences, and that is really the aspiration of people to have a greater say in their own affairs, to see an equitable and fair and transparent process, to have equality with regard to opportunity. And I think really these fundamental principles are what are driving much of the change in the East and North Africa. They've driven change elsewhere. And at least speaking for MEPI, we're happy to find a way that we can play a role and continue to support and assist those who are trying to make those aspirations. So I'll close there. Okay.
Well, thank you very much. I think we're going to open it up for questions, but I'll exercise my prerogative and throw out the first one. And I agree with Tom that there is this universality of a yearning for democratic rights around the world. It doesn't matter if you're from Burma or Indonesia or Chile or anywhere in Europe. But at the same time, I take your point, Ambassador Pearson, about how different these transitions are unfolding in the Middle East as compared to Eastern Europe. And there was really a rush early on to see, well, what lessons can be shared there. And I think some were shared. But speaking as a former ambassador to Turkey, that is a model that a lot of countries in the region do look to. And I was traveling in the region in September when Prime Minister Erdogan made a visit, and he was really treated like a rock star from Egypt to Libya to Tunisia, and I wonder if you could comment on that.
Thanks, Barry. I think it's a very good observation. I think the Turks tell us that Erdogan is the most popular politician in the region now, and I think that the concept of having an Islamic-oriented party participating in a democratic system with a constitution and so on is a good example. And I look to Ennahda in Tunisia, and to some extent the Muslim Brotherhood as guiding their approach more on the Turkish experience than on any other. So I think that whatever individual differences the United States may have with Turkey from time to time, some of their domestic policies about freedom of the press and freedom of expression are attracting even more attention. Nevertheless, the concept that a modern Islamic-oriented political party can govern a democratic state with a large population and succeed in having economic growth is a powerful example. I think the Turks probably would tell us that they don't want to be a model, but they would be very happy to be an example. And so, in that sense, I think we're lucky in a way that despite some problems here and there, that we have Turkey in the region to act as a kind of guide in the ways that the Arabs consider to be very important as they move ahead.
So we want to take maybe 3 questions at a time.
Thank you. A couple of related questions about Egypt that I'm addressing is mainly, I guess, to Barry and Scott.
Could you just say who you are, just to let us know who?
I'm sorry?
Could you just introduce yourself briefly? Say who you are.
My name is Russell Micheloff. I have no institutional affiliation.
Okay, thank you.
A couple of related questions about Egypt. There is, I think, considerable uncertainty about the intent of the SCAF, the military authorities. In particular, do they really plan a transition in the near term to democratic governance, or do they intend that the military remain the power behind the throne? There is, secondly, there is a currently, as you know, a dispute, involving a couple of NGOs, including your own, which is getting nasty and threatening, I think, bilateral relationships, with the UN, including threats to cut off aid. And I'm wondering, is that something we should really seriously consider, and how do you see this playing out?
Thank you. Salam al-Mu'alla from Jordan. Thank you so much for this event. A couple of very quick comments, and then I will...
Sorry, can you also give your affiliation?
Oh, I am from the Jordan National Movement. And my question is, let me make a couple of comments. The first one is, all of a sudden, and in fact, before the defected president of Tunisia took the airplane to Saudi Arabia, in the US Congress, they depicted him, they described him as a reformer, pro-democracy, so forth and so on. And not too long time ago, we rolled the red carpet for Egyptian officials, and including the former president Mubarak. And we are doing the same thing, the same exact mistake right now, regarding other countries that are embracing and about to embrace the Arab Spring, the winter, the summer, and so forth and so on, including my home country, Jordan, the Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain is another one. When are we going to stop this? When are we going to say to those Arab leaders, those dictators, that enough is enough, and we say loud and clear that you need to listen to your own people, rather than giving them political support, like what we just did to the King of Jordan just a few weeks ago. He went back to Jordan and he imprisoned Dr. Ahmed Awad al-Abbadi, a scholar, just for speaking up against the king and his policies. And imprisoned 2 activists, Uday Abu Isa, just because he tore down his the king's picture in one of the protests in Madaba, in the south of Amman. So we give them the support and they go back and they do all kinds of types of bad things to our own people. Now you go to the region and you say, we are ready to help you out. And we have kind of like change of heart. Is this real? I mean, are you kidding me that you're going to go back and say, we've been supporting your own dictators, and overnight we are ready to help your own organizations? That is going to take long time ago. I mean, long time from now, maybe a few years from now. We need to have a strategy, ladies and gentlemen. We need to have a long-term strategy to deal with what Scott mentioned, the new political structures in the Middle East.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And just right over here with by the post there.
Thanks. So I think when we look at these situations as the revolutions are
Could you
unfolding,
identify yourself?
I'm sorry, I'm Brian Stout with USAID, but I'm just an interested SID member at this point. When you see the revolutions unfolding, I think the U.S. international community makes a calculus about the capacity of the regime to quell or quash, the capacity of the people to survive and withstand, and then sort of balancing our own interests, makes a decision about how to engage. And I think in Iran, the Green Revolution, we saw one sort of pragmatic approach, and with Egypt and South Africa, a different approach. Yet the administration has also promulgated a study directive on mass atrocities, and the American people, and Congress, and the international community don't like watching civilians being attacked. So my question for Tom is, how does that consideration influence policy? For the rest of the panel, how should it? How does that sort of evolving levels of violence impact how the U.S. should respond to these situations? And I'm particularly curious from the permanent perspective as well. Thanks.
Last 2 questions were really both for Tom, so maybe I'll let you start with those and then we can talk about it just a little bit.
Thank you. I think it's important to honestly look ahead. I think it's reasonable to ask questions and make criticisms about past U.S. policy, but it's a new day, and there's a new approach in the region, but obviously it needs to take into account very complicated situations and a range of U.S. interests. I also think it's important not to expect there to be dramatic change or to anticipate that there necessarily will be dramatic change in every place, under every circumstance. But I think it's important to maintain discussions and even pressure where it's relevant on the governments to continue to respond to the interests of their people. And in some cases, I think, by definition, that may happen more incrementally than in others. But it is indeed a fundamental interest and priority for this administration. And I understand that in some cases there will be a lack of satisfaction with the pace and the scope of change. But that doesn't undermine, I think, the fundamental interest that continues to inform U.S. policy in the region. On this second question about the level of violence, I want to make sure I understand your question. Is it the degree to which U.S. policy needs to respond to circumstances based on the level of violence that's involved?
Yeah, I mean, specifically thinking about Syria, is there a point at which that does influence the calculus that you previously made?
Yeah. Well, obviously, as a number of State Department and U.S. government officials have made clear, we condemn violence not only in Syria but elsewhere, and in all its forms. Certainly, the violence that has taken place in Syria has, I think, made clear to us, and it should to everybody in the world, the absolute lack of legitimacy in the Assad regime. And I think it completely undermines the government's own arguments about who's behind these assaults on the populations. Clearly, this represents the aspirations of this population for a different form of government. But it's true, when the level of violence increases to the extent it has there, it has seized the attention of this administration and others as well. You've seen that reflected in efforts to, both in the Security Council and in the General Assembly, to try to condemn the violence and bring pressure to bear against the government, the Assad regime, to change its ways. And you're seeing in the formation of this Friends of Syria group, which is going to meet on the 24th, to discuss how the international community can better support the Syrian people and better come together to try to bring change to that country. So I think, again, the principles are the same regardless, but when you do see this, I think, outrageous level of violence, it certainly does inspire a greater sense of urgency, and I think that's appropriate.
So, of course, the million-dollar question right now is the SCAF intent on staying in power and doesn't really want a democratic system to work? You know, there are a lot of theories about that. And I don't have any more insight on it than the other theories the theories you're reading and hearing about. I think the short answer at this point is we don't know. We do know that Egypt had an election that, for all intents and purposes, was a credible election. And that's one step toward moving the country into a more democratic environment of governance and rule. The crackdown we are seeing on civil society groups has generated a lot of attention toward our organizations, but I think it's important to put in perspective that there were 17 organizations raided, not just IRI and NDI. Included a German non-governmental organization, it included a number of Egyptian organizations. And it's rumored that as many as 400 Egyptian civil society organizations are now ensnared in this so-called investigation. Whether or not we should continue the aid relationship we've had with Egypt in the past, of course, is a question for the administration and for decision makers in Congress to consider carefully. One thing I will say, though, is in the past, there was a sense of shared strategic partnership with Egyptian decision makers. And it's hard to see that right now with the ongoing assault on civil society groups, recognizing that for the United States, assisting Egypt in cultivating a more democratic environment is an important interest of ours. It's difficult to see that with Americans essentially held hostage in the country. And so I hope that those factors will, and I think they are, weighing heavily on the discussions that are occurring about the future of the Egypt-US partnership. Also, we'll just say that it seems a lot of this is being driven by a minister who wants to control resources, who happens to be a long-standing holdover of Mubarak and fighting to ensure survival in the future. I brought with me today part of the investigative report, which she testifies to the end of the day. In it she says, with respect to civil society and democracy assistance, the issues seem noble on the surface, but in fact they have always been linked to Israeli interests and managing the Egyptian-American relationship to satisfy Israel's interests. And the United States, again in reference to civil society support, peddles funding to American and Egyptian civil society organizations to improve its relations with the US Congress and Jewish lobbyists. I'm not sure that's a person that should be managing hundreds of millions of dollars of US assistance. And hopefully, in the future relationship, there'll be some serious consideration about whether that ministry and whether she should have control over those resources.
Yeah, I'd just like to add a few words to that. As we said earlier, transitions are messy. Egypt is a country of over 80 million people. It is a country where, in the past, the United States had one interlocutor, and now there are multiple power centers. So I think at this point to say, is the SCAF planning this transition? I'm not sure they are fully in control. There is a transition underway. As Scott said, the People's Assembly elections were very credible. The People's Assembly is sitting. They are calling ministers for testimony. They have called, in fact, the minister that Scott was referring to, they have called her to testify. And so they started talking about this very onerous NGO law that is partly what has ensnared us. So I think, again, it's take the long view, know that there are going to be bumps in the road. I mean, these are pretty like boulders in the road right now, but I think they can still be overcome. Egypt will have a presidential election in May. There will be a new government. So I think we all have to step back, even as we, very much have, a lot of concern for all of our staff in Egypt, Americans, Serbians, and Egyptians who are in the middle of a political maelstrom that is not of our making. And it all hinges on this registration issue. We attempted to register in 2005. I mean, and IRI did as well. We all have papers on file with the government. We've tried again in January. Now we've resubmitted our applications. So I think, we all hope that a peaceful resolution to this will be found, that these charges that are quite ridiculous will be dropped. Not just against us, but against just the attack on Egyptian civil society. Egyptian civil society, which is so rich and varied, and people who have just come out from all different quarters to support a transition, to work on issues that are very basic, nonpartisan voter education, trying to make candidates and elected leaders more accountable to citizens, kind of all the nuts and bolts of what makes a democracy work. But I think that in any country, and this again, the Turkey model, or Indonesia, or Chile, or even the United States after our own revolution, getting militaries out of politics is not always easy. I think the SCAF is worried about oversight of its budget, all these issues that are going to have to be worked out in the months ahead.
No, I think you covered it. Thank you. Great.
Okay, 3 more questions. Let's start over here.
Phil Zager, Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. I have 2 quick questions. First, regarding the Gulf and the demographics of the Gulf, how it's mostly expatriates. Are there not enough Arabs to hold an Arab Spring? And second, in Egypt, where do you see Coptic Christians fitting into the new political order? Thank you.
Daniel Lambert, University of Denver. I'm wondering what the implications of the Arab Spring are for people who identify as bisexual, lesbian, and gay.
Jesse Simmons, United Nations Information Center. You mentioned the UN General Assembly and Security Council, as well as Friends of Syria group, Mr. Vita. I was wondering if you could advise these groups, or the Arab League, or NATO, or any other multilateral organization, what sort of effective or more effective action can be taken to protect Syrian people in the short term. How do you think this General Assembly resolution is going to influence events on the ground in Syria, and what further action can be taken?
Bob, can I ask you to take the first 2? The first question was actually 2 questions, and then the second as well.
On the Gulf and demographics, I think that maybe that's not quite the right yardstick to use. Qatar was very active in the Libyan liberation exercise, and that obviously was a very deliberate choice for them. And so I think that if you're in the Gulf today, the people who are running the countries are thinking seriously about what kind of responses they're going to have to come up with. The pressure in Bahrain is just going to increase. The Saudis cannot afford to have instability in the Gulf in face of Iranian ambitions. So I wouldn't put this off on demographics, but I would just say that I'm sure there's some candles burning late at night, oil flares maybe, burning late at night to make sure that they are thinking about these issues. On the LGBT, I'll just say that for my organization, and I'll bet for others, every program that we put forward now has an LGBT component to it, and we don't view it as a kind of separate issue. We view it as integrated among all the issues for civil society development and social reform that we address, and we're happy to do that.
Maybe talk about the Coptic Christians.
Sure. Actually, I think the issue of Coptic Christians, LGBT, it all sort of fits into this importance of minority rights within the context of political change occurring across the region. We are very much making a focus of our ongoing political party building programs, civil society advocacy, assistance efforts, the importance of minority rights and consideration within the context of political transition. That is through helping train, provide information to, and teach advocacy efforts for groups engaged and interested in those issues, and trying to make certain that that minorities are not left out of transition with respect to consideration in constitutions, consideration in legal rights, consideration of family law, those sorts of things.
And the last question.
A question on Syria. These are very reasonable questions to ask under the circumstances, and I can simply assure you that they're being discussed at the highest levels of the U.S. government. There's intense, really, attention and engagement on this issue. But it's nothing that I'm in a position to speak to today. But I will say that the issues you raise are the ones that are being contemplated: how to support the opposition, how to address the growing humanitarian crisis, how to bring greater pressure to bear on the Assad regime, and support a peaceful transition. And the whole point of the UN Security Council resolution effort, the General Assembly, and certainly Friends of Syria, is to try to build a coherent international consensus on the way forward. And so even as we're deliberating these questions internally in the U.S. government, there's clearly an effort to reach out to partners and allies and solicit their views and then try to come to a common approach on the way forward. And I think many of these issues are going to come out publicly and be discussed at this Friends of Syria, so I would just encourage you to stay tuned and watch those discussions.
Hoping the panel could give their thoughts regarding the effects of these developments on economic and social progress, and how should we pivot with respect to our development policy in the area, in the region. And then more specifically, to Mr. Vada, frankly, do we have the discipline to implement and enforce this Middle East Incentive Fund? It seems like a great idea on the face, and that is to try to incentivize reforms. But what happens when diplomatic priorities take precedence and our need to engage with these countries runs head-to-head with the failure to fulfill their obligations under this new fund?
My name is Abdel Al-Muallab from Jordan National Movement. First of all, I want to thank very much for Al Jazeera. Without Al Jazeera, we don't have any revolutions. This is the truth. You know, until Mr. Scott yesterday, the ex-Crown Prince Hassan of Jordan, he criticized John McCain, you know, and he criticized the United States. You see how many million dollars were there, and you know, he criticized John McCain. He said John McCain, he want to make war in the Middle East, and he want to make blah blah blah. You know, all things going on over there. But even the ex-Prime Minister of Jordan, his name Ali Barrada, he said, I don't like America. I study in America, I don't like America. Those corrupt regime, they don't like the situation. You see how the things change? I want to tell you something, you know. In Arab people, you know, you have to always make connection with them, you know. The image of the United States is very good now because thank you for President Obama, who stand by the revolutions. As we stand behind the people and not the dictator, the things will change. The image of the United States start very nice. All brotherhood start open dialogues. Even Jordan National Movement, the chairman is now in jail. He was visiting the United States Embassy in Jordan. He opened. Everybody wisdom, not just the king. Me, I love the United States. Everybody like my state. So my question is, please, our challenge is the corruptions, the old corruption people. There be the corruption also. Please, this is very important. Thank you.
The question.
The question is, just, you know, I mean, those are the old corruptions, you know, the old corruption we face, you know, this is the challenge.
Okay.
We need to, you know, always we have to discuss those issues.
Okay, so
Thank you very much.
I appreciate Scott's answer to very, very candidly about what the Egyptian context is and particular minister in charge of the question about NGO relations. But this also follows on a changing situation globally about what the role of international NGOs is. And while we're very comfortable in our own society of distinguished governance structures for NGOs, even when they receive U.S. government money, most of the world increasingly doesn't either understand or certainly doesn't appreciate that there is a sense that there may be an influence, even if those NGOs believe they're quite independent, even though they have significant government funding. I'm wondering whether you in the Middle East context are beginning to draw some new thoughts about how do we ensure the thoughtful participation, whether it's on democracy, advocacy programs, or other development programs, to ensure the sense of integrity that the leaders of NGOs have when in fact they receive sizable amounts of U.S. government money, which leads to a difference in perception from those that were most trying to reach out to help. It's a conundrum, which is not just because of the Egypt situation, but that's sort of heightens what is a growing concern about all NGO involvement internationally. So if you could comment on that, are your institutions stepping back and saying, what does this mean for us in the future, not just in the democracy advocacy context of Egypt? Thank you.
Okay, let me see, I'm going to split this up. Maybe Bob and Scott, the first question, the effects of these political developments on social and economic progress and how that can be better supported.
Okay, I'll start. Let me just say that the focus has been on sort of democratic change and governance and so on today in the discussion. You're absolutely right. And one of the principal issues that concerns my organization, and I'm sure everybody else up here in MEPI as well, simply the demographics of the region and the level of unemployment. And if you looked at the levels of income for families in Egypt before the revolution, they have not changed. They have not changed. And if I were going to draw a lesson from the ex-Soviet experience, it would be that once the Russian people realized that they were not getting better lives out of the changes in 1991 and 1992, that's when you began to see the backlash. So now, your fair and toughest question is how do you do that? And the only way to do that really is working through the local organizations in whom you have trust. But they don't know everything, and that's why the role of INGOs is critical to helping them make their programs effective. That would be my approach, but I don't think that throwing a lot of money at them or putting out vanity development programs is going to make a difference. And it's going to take some time to do it, and it will take 5 to 10 years to begin to make a difference. Last point, in Central America, when those revolutions ended, It took 10 years for those economies to reach the point they were before the revolutions began. So I'm just explaining facts of life to you, but giving people hope that this is going to get better is the next best thing to making it better. So that would be my response.
Just to add quickly that I completely agree with what was just said. And I go back to this point of, in the past, the assistance that was given, economic assistance, in many ways was seen as helping entrench undemocratic practices and rulers as opposed to actually resulting in development goals or directly benefiting people. So I think this notion of the need to work with local groups is very important. And incidentally is the crux of the controversy with Egypt right now about, does the funding and assistance go through someone and through a ministry and through the government, or is the United States going to work directly with people of the region?
Tom, do you want to take the question on incentive funds?
So for those who don't know, in President Obama's FY13 budget request, he is seeking $770 million for what's called the Middle East North Africa Incentive Fund. And this represents an acknowledgement by the administration of the need to be more systematic in terms of trying to support reform through the region. Obviously, in fiscal years 11 and even 12, there was a need to basically cobble together funding for the region from existing programs. So this is the first opportunity to put forward a budget that takes into account the changes in the region and puts forward a way in which the U.S. government can respond. In fact, as it's envisioned, MEPI would fall under this Middle East North African Incentive Fund. And a lot of questions need to be worked out. First and foremost, the discussion with the Congress about this. But the idea is that clearly there are governments that are involved in transition and that are committed to reform. And the U.S. government is looking to kind of support those reforms with assistance that directly promotes their implementation. And in many cases, that might even be enshrined in some form of a bilateral agreement. At the same time, the activities of MEPI and others will continue to be important to ensure that civil society and that the people of the region also have a say in some of these reforms, so that it's not simply government to government or top-down from the government, but that it's an interactive process in which the voices of populations are reflected. So we'll see where these discussions with Congress go, but I think the most important thing is really the government's commitment to identify a new and flexible way to respond to the change in the region and to have a tool available and funding available to do all we can to assist the process.
The next question was on addressing corruption, and I would say corruption is at the nexus of all of these developments, both from the despair over paying off these small bribes that led Mohammed Bouazizi to light himself on fire, and and just to the demands, the broader demands for greater accountability and the linkages between corruption and kind of the lack of opportunities for those who are not part of patronage networks or don't have access to funds from the state. So I mean, I think it's just really at the heart. I mean, I think that's what civic groups and politicians from many of these new emerging parties, or the parties that are now legal, I think people are very much trying to grapple with that, and I think that the U.S. is supporting that through support.
Are we switching towards that direction? I mean, the United States and the State Department's programs towards that. Are we switching gears and focusing on those NGOs in our own countries?
Well, I can let Tom speak for the U.S. government, but I think he already said that. I mean, there are core interests that the United States has, will always have in the Middle East, but that the strategies, the ways of addressing them are to have changed dramatically in the past year, and that's a good thing. I don't know, do you want to add anything else to that?
Well, they're seeing very little. I mean, it's not that much. I mean, we're talking to the people and they say they come to our own countries and they meet with officials from the governments in hotels, and the embassies, and they do meet with civil society and civil organizations, NGOs, but not that much. I mean, maybe it is going a bit slow in that direction, but we need more visibility. We need more efforts from the State Department, from other NGOs to engage our communities, our local communities.
I would just challenge the assumption that these are somehow empty statements or empty promises. I can tell you that there's really a fundamental change in the way we're approaching the region in terms of our priorities. And I see it internally in the way the State Department operates and in terms of the guidance and instructions that goes out to our embassies and our ambassadors in the region. So I regret that the change you see is not perhaps visible enough or moving fast enough, but again, I don't want to create the impression that this is anything other than a real and genuine effort on our part. But again, these interests with regard to transitions in political form are fundamental to supporting the interests of the people in the region and our own interests, but those interests are quite broad and they remain broad as they have to be. I mean, it's an important and complicated part of the world.
You're going to speak to the INGO issue as well? Okay, good, great. And maybe this is just a piece of it, but I like the fact that your colleague referenced Al Jazeera and corruption. Because quite honestly, transparency and the ability to bring facts to light and have public reaction to them is probably the most powerful tool that you can have to begin the process of talking about corruption. Al Jazeera certainly has raised the level of public information in the region as other countries have tried to compete. So this is an indigenous responsibility. I don't know, for Americans, if you picked out an American state that you'd like to reform, would you really invite a Canadian NGO to come in and take care of the corruption issues in that state? No. So in your case, I understand your anguish and your concern, but I think that my response would be your efforts at transparency and your efforts at investigative journalism. My organization, for example, has set up independent radio stations in Jordan, okay? And so we believe that that is a very, very powerful tool in getting this dialogue begun. So I'm not saying that that's a complete answer for you, but I do think that it is an important step which is in your hands to make more powerful.
Are you ratcheting up the pressure on these rogue regimes to get rid of corruption and human rights abuses? We are suffering. I mean, we are still suffering in Jordan and elsewhere. I'm just making very quick
No, I think it's been addressed, so I think we'll go on to the last question about how to explain, if I can make sure I've got your question right, just how to better explain U.S. government policy and support for international NGOs such as ours.
Shifted around, I was really asking how can we as NGOs who are quite comfortable with partnerships, public-private partnerships, if you want to call it that, but the world is increasingly concerned and voices a concern whether or not that's a transparent relationship and how to interpret that relationship when there's U.S. government money involved in what we see as independent actors as NGOs. But most people increasingly don't. It's a new serious issue which I think the Egyptian concerns, even though they may be politically motivated, does illustrate well, though, this growing concern that we will have to face.
Well, I'll just say please, and I'll pass it along, because I actually think that is, it's an opportunity. I mean, as difficult as this Egyptian situation is, it has created this opportunity for us as an organization to talk much more. We've got a large stage now to talk about what we do and how we do it. And I think we'll all have some lessons learned on how to do that better. I think we've tried in all the countries, where we've worked, to be very transparent. And in fact, Egypt aside, we've had an outpouring, I'm sure Ira as well, an outpouring of support from partners in different countries, but also from
representatives from government as well who do understand how we work and that we have been transparent. But this is an opportunity, I think.
Yeah, I too, I guess, am somewhat hopeful that maybe part of the silver lining in all of this could be that there is more understanding about what it is organizations like IRI and NPI and other international organizations do, who we are. I though would also say simply that it's a pretty unique circumstance right now because we've been doing work for over 30 years in more than 100 countries and never has something like this happened. So I think it's safe to say that there are around the world many countries where the involvement of international NGOs are welcome as part of a ongoing process of development or political transition. And so it's not, I don't know that this is necessarily reflective of a growing concern or suspicion about the involvement of international NGOs. I'm not sure that's a correct assumption about all of this.
I probably should have spoken before, Scott, because I have a slightly less optimistic perspective on it. We feel pressure in countries to meet certain requirements before we register. We feel pressure about transparency about our funding. We feel pressure in desire to want to help shape our programs. And I think that this probably will continue to be the case. And I think that there is a generalized level of antipathy to American NGOs or INGOs that seems to capture the sense of lack of good intentions or lack of authenticity about our purpose. And I would just say that I would try to capture a couple of ideas in saying this, that I don't think there's an objection to the what. In other words, there's a recognition of the skill level, there's a recognition of the experience level, there's a recognition of the capacity to help. And therefore it gets down to how it's done. And that kind of gets back to one of my points, including the last point, which is, and I think you'd agree with it, Steve, which is that the local organizations really do have to be brought to the point where they can lead, and we can buttress that leadership. And so I think that's the change that has to take place, and I think it's going to be messy because it's going to be different, a little bit, it's not programmed at this point. But I do think that the function of INGOs can continue, but the method in which we function is going to change.
Thank you. I think that's a great way to put this to a close. I would like to thank Sid for hosting this and thank the panelists.